Hello and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program where we speak about the situation of the suffering church around the world. In 2010, the world watched with wonder and some concern at the so-called Arab Spring spreading across the Middle East. Today, the Arab Spring, some have said, has turned to an Arab winter, with dire consequences for the local Christians. To tell us more, it is my great privilege to welcome Fr Joseph Ellul, a lecturer in Islamic studies in both Rome and Malta. Fr Joseph, thank you for being here with us today in our program.
My pleasure.
Fr Joseph, we want to talk about the question of the Arab Spring, how this has caught the world by surprise and the world's reaction to it. What was the cause? What was the source of this so-called Arab Spring?
Let's start with the term spring. Back in 1968, there was another spring. It was called the Prague Spring. And what has remained in the memory of so many people who lived during that period was the self-immolation of Jan Palach, that student who set himself on fire in Wenceslav Square. Now, let's roll over the years, so to speak, and what happened in Tunisia. What we know today as the Arab Spring began with the self-immolation of a street vendor. And that triggered a move. It was actually not the reason why, it was the occasion for
Exactly.
What happened.
So it was the spark.
The spark, exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
What was everything that had built up to the spark?
Yes. North Africa and the Middle East were countries that belonged to colonial powers, either France or Britain. They were either directly colonized or else they were a protectorate or a mandate, etc.
Yes.
When these countries gained independence, there was a lot of euphoria. I mean, now we are a nation, we are Tunisians, we are Algerians, we are Syrians, we are whatever.
A sense of pride,
national pride, plus a sense of Arab unity. It was, the 1950s, you had that slogan, Pan-Arabism with Nasser in Egypt, and then it spread to Syria and Iraq and other places. However, this enthusiasm for something that we belong, we are a nation, we are Tunisians, it was dampened by one thing, that is corruption.
So in fact, it was all deceived. This sense of pride had been undercut by corruption.
It has been undercut by corruption. There were reforms that were successful. Progress as regards women's rights, for example. In Tunisia, in Algeria, women were allowed to, for example, to go to work. Again, in Tunisia, for example, where the revolution began, in Tunisia was the first, and as far as I know, the only country where polygamy was prohibited by law. It was considered illegal to marry more than one wife. So, there was a lot of progress on the social level. But, on the other hand, there remained a great gap between those in government and the people.
The aspiration.
The aspirations of the people were not being met.
Many have suggested that social media played a very key role. Some would suggest that, I've been speaking, for example, to directors of Sat7, the Christian television network in the Middle East, and they said perhaps more television rather than social media, but nonetheless, that media played a very crucial role in this Arab Spring. Can you tell me, from your perspective, how did social media, what was the key for social media here?
I wouldn't say that social media played a marginal role, because if you consider the fact that the media, television, was being controlled by the state Fine, you have satellite television that would beam up what was taking place on the street. But social media, I mean, you wouldn't be able to bring together all those masses of people without Twitter, without mobile phones, without SMSs, etc. That would not have been possible.
If the groundwork was being prepared, we saw that the boiling pot was the pot was coming to a boil, why did it catch the world by such surprise? Why was nobody informed or aware that this might explode?
Perhaps it was because these countries had a very strong security apparatus. And although, I mean, it has been penetrated times, I mean, in Egypt, for example, the terrorist attack on Luxor and Karnak, quite a few years ago, took the security forces by surprise. But many people thought that by and large, they would be suppressed by the army, by the security forces, and that would be it. But when you had when you had a phenomenon that was not limited to a group, it was something popular, it was a mass movement.
It was a movement.
Added to this, one must also keep in mind the contribution not of the poor classes, but of the educated and of the upper middle classes in the Arab, in what was known as the Arab Spring. I mean, Twitter, Facebook. I mean, you wouldn't find this.
These are not tools among the poor.
Exactly. I mean, these are of the nouveau riche.
So these are middle class people seeking change.
Yes.
Now, the call was for freedom. But did they know freedom? Do they know, and did they know at the time what they were calling for? Because in fact, the question could be posed that they had never experienced this freedom.
Okay. Now, I would propose to answer this question in two ways. First, one would equate freedom with democracy, which is true. But what type of democracy? I mean, liberal democracy is only one type of democracy. It is not the only one, and it's not necessarily the best one.
All right, so we put the political one aside, let's say.
Now, secondly, one has to keep in mind that one has to respect the culture of the place. You cannot understand what's going on in the Middle East with a, in inverted commas, Western frame of mind, liberal democracy type. Okay, so that is one thing. Secondly, coming to your question, we've noticed in Iraq, in Egypt, in Libya, not so much in Tunisia and Algeria, it might come as a surprise, but in these countries, when you have this revolution, so you topple the regime, now what comes next? Now, if you are going to get rid of everybody, you are going to create a vacuum. So, I mean, there were people in Egypt, in Libya, in Iraq. Fine, they were connected with the regime in some way or another, but they were good people. They were honest people. One needed a certain continuation so the handover would be smoother. But if you are going to erase everything and think that you are going to start from scratch, you are going to create pandemonium. And that is exactly what happened in Iraq. That's exactly what's happening in Libya now. In Egypt, it did not happen because the army stepped in and the army was still very strong.
But everywhere else we've seen, in fact, a vacuum and a collapse.
Exactly.
Which brings me to my next question. Why has this movement not been able to convert itself into a viable political project?
When you have a terrible regime, as it was experienced in these countries, I mean, these people have executed, tortured, gotten rid of anybody who could give a decent contribution. So there was nobody to replace them. I mean, they were either in exile or they were already dead.
So the flower of the generation.
Exactly. So what did you have? Movements from the outside. Al-Qaeda, the movement for an Islamic caliphate, as you would have now, for example, in Syria. Perhaps in Iraq also, the problem was that in order to bring about the democratization of Iraq, the caretaker administration did away with even the police force that was in place during Saddam Hussein's regime. And that meant that you had nobody to protect, to police
They swept the table clean.
Exactly, and there was nothing else.
And nothing else.
So terrorism entered.
And in fact, this is the question: have these movements then been hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, by the Salafists, and to what end?
Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, I wouldn't say that the Muslim Brotherhood hijacked. The Salafists, yes. But the Muslim Brotherhood did have a project. Fine, they did commit a few mistakes, grave mistakes. For example, forcing a referendum on the Sharia, and the result of it was very doubtful at best. With the Salafist movement, what you had in place was actually getting rid of anything that was non-Islamic, that seemed un-Islamic and therefore anti-Islamic. Now, you cannot live in a niche. I mean, you have to communicate with the outside, saying that the inside is good, what we're doing is good, what is going on in the outside is bad, is reminiscent of the ideology of the Eastern Bloc during the communist period and during the Cold War, which brings us to another point. What has hijacked, in many instances, what we now know, what we now call the Arab Spring, is the presentation of Islam as an ideology. Islam is not a religion. It was presented as an ideology. Take a look at the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, when it is written in their own statutes that Islam is our religion, the Quran is our constitution.
Yes.
So when a religion is transformed into an ideology, that doesn't bode well.
Yes, on the contrary. The question now arises, has this so-called springtime been a springtime for moderate Muslims and Christians? Because it strikes me that we've washed the table clean, we've removed the dictatorship, and we've now come in with a new project, which is perhaps Islam as a political project. But it is almost at the same time a purification of Islam. It is, we are going to introduce a new kind of Islam which is purer, which is really the true Islam. Now, who judges what is true Islam is another question, but my question to you is, has this now, the springtime, been detrimental for moderate Muslims and moderate Islam and Christianity?
I'll take my cue from what you have said. The idea of the pure Islam, that is something ideological. That's something totally ideological. Now, allow me to make a comment on when you spoke about moderate Muslims. I have a problem with these adjectives. I mean, when I hear on radio and watch on TV discussions speaking about conservative, progressive, hardline, moderate, I mean, these are ideological adjectives that are being applied to religion, and it's very bad chemistry. I would say that Muslims are Muslims, okay, fine, but you would find Muslims who would be very much in favor of a certain tradition, which is nothing. There's nothing wrong in that. There are others who wish for a more dynamic interpretation of the Quran, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, both those who are very much applying tradition and those who want a more dynamic, Both of them are hurt right to the core, seeing Islam being sold, to use a commercial term, being sold out as an ideology. That is hurting them, and they are very disappointed, which is why, for example, taking the case of Egypt, the army had the approval
the popular
of the population.
Yes, to take control
Yes,
again.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Is Islam in crisis? Can one say that the violence, that this extraordinary violence that we're seeing in Syria, for example, and Iraq, between the Sunni and the Shia, and thankfully, as you mentioned, the Iraq in Egypt, the army stepped in to moderate the situation. But this violence,
Yes.
Is Islam at a crossroads and in crisis, and we're not seeing an Islam of strength, but we're seeing an Islam afraid?
When somebody in the name of religion uses violence, that is a sign of deep ingrained insecurity. You cannot do it by persuasion, so you do it by force. And this has been detrimental to Islam. Again, in these countries such as Iraq, such as Syria, such as Egypt, such as Libya, it was, Muslims suffered just as Christians have suffered. Of course, Christians, and here we come to your previous question too, Christians bear the brunt because it's always convenient to have, to home in on the enemy who is not one of ours, one of us. So yes, when you have violence and when you have these movements who are inflamed by ideology and not by a certain zeal and devotion for their religion, yes, that it becomes detrimental to the religion itself.
Now, I'm going to ask you a bit of a, perhaps not a fair question, but I'm going to ask you to be a prophet. Europe and America experienced revolutions some 200, 300 years ago, which over time, over centuries, have brought us to the democratic structures that we have in place today. If I was to ask you to be a prophet, is this the revolution of Islam in the Muslim world? And where are we going? What can we see? What can we prophesize down 200 years in the future?
Well,
where are we going to be?
Things are developing at a very fast pace. What I can say is this: if there is any hope to salvage the sacrifice of so many who have given their lives in order to bring down oppression, I believe that the only solution is to strike a balance between the concept of citizenship and belief. We are citizens and we are believers. We are not citizens or believers. And that would open the way not only in the Middle East, not only for Muslims, but also for those who are not Muslims. I mean, Christians are citizens of these countries. Even during the post-colonial period and during the revolutions that took place to take out colonialism, I mean, Christians have given their contribution. So if we revive, if we can bring strike a balance between citizenship and belief, bring them together. Tunisians, perhaps not because the overwhelming majority are Muslim, but if we take, for example, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, where the Christians are a minority, but they are a significant minority. If we can speak of a spring that would bring together the notion of citizenship and belief. We are citizens and believers. We as believers, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, we can contribute to the well-being of our society. That would bode well for the future in these countries.
However, is this conceivable in Islam? Because we, for example, in the West, we are working hard for the complete separation of church and state. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is not our discussion for the moment. However, for the Muslim, this is inconceivable that the person, the human person, should separate God from his complete person, whether it's political, social, otherwise. No. So my question to you is this conceivable within the Islamic or the Muslim mentality?
Yeah, good question. Look, it is true that Islam is conceived as religion and state, deen wa dawla. That's true. However, it all depends on whether you are going to interpret a text maintaining a social framework that leads to the 7th century, or whether you are going to interpret the text of the Quran and say, look, we have to find new ways of interpreting and looking at the text of the Quran in this manner in order to see it in the light of new circumstances. At this point, I would like to refer you to a text of the Quran. If I'm not mistaken, it is in chapter 5, the chapter of the table, verse 48, where the Quran, of course it's God who is speaking, says, had we wanted, we would have made you one nation, one community. But, it says, the text goes on and says, so compete with each other, who does best, and on the last day, you will be held, God will judge from among you. Now that is a verse of hope. Had we wanted, we would have made you one nation. Obviously, God did not want, even according to the Quran itself. So, compete with each other. Give space to those who are non-Muslim to be able to say, look, let us vie in each other in doing good, for the common good, the good of the country, the good of society, and we leave the judgment to God. Why not?
Father, we're running out of time, but I want to know one last question. What is it we can do? What can we do to pray? What do we do? Inform ourselves? How do we manage this question of what we've just been talking about over this last half hour?
I think that the first thing we need to inform ourselves better. When we come to the media, any type of media, but especially when it comes to news fora, newspapers, etc. I mean, opinion pieces are opinion pieces. So we have to reflect on what is being said. We have to learn to read into events, and we have to learn to have more solidarity, especially with the Christian communities who are living in these troubled times, in these troubled areas, and it's not easy. As I said, most of them are bearing the brunt of the situation. Secondly, the fact that we need to tell our Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East, look, we know what we are going through. We are presenting your plight outside of your nation, so that people would know what you are going through.
So they're not alone.
You are not alone, exactly. You are not alone. And that is already a lot. I mean, many things have to come out from the inside. They cannot come from the outside because they won't be accepted. But the fact that we can tell them, look, we are with you, we are following you, we are praying for you, we are helping you even materially to better your situation. Food aid, financing of school, orphanages, etc. That is already a lot. You leave it up to them because they are the indigenous Christians and they are the ones who know the situation. But at least that we can tell them, we are here, we know what you're going through, and we can help.
Father Joseph, thank you very much for having been with us today in our program.
Same here. Thank you very much.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today on Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more, please inform yourself and pray for our Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East at this difficult, difficult time. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.